Hi, people. Here is an important article by socialist and black liberation fighter Brian Taylor. On January 30th of 2021, Oakland Socialists organized a meeting for him to speak at. Here is a recording of that meeting.
Some of our past experiences with movements have shattered or become something that they weren't. And I'm no different. So I started in high school with friends of mine, started some independent political organizations. One was called African Awareness. You know, I was active around the Gulf War. This is back in the early 90s. Well, actually, the late 80s and then early 90s. Independent kind of activists who started doing clinic defense against people attacking abortion rights. Went to South Africa, joined the struggle there, coming sort of towards the end of being in high school. Temporarily joined the ANC there and kind of joined that campaign for a while. Spent some time in Cuba on the way back and worked my way into joining the Young Socialist, which was actually there was no Young Socialist. Helped form a new revival of the Young Socialist with some other people. Went through the Socialist Workers Party, was a member in the U.S. Socialist Workers Party, was a member for somewhere between 17 and 19 years. And then I was a minor as well. So I don't know if you're underground or exactly what you were doing, John, but I know that life. Did it for 7 years. First black miner in the South in 25. Anyway, yeah, and now I'm here fighting with other individuals. Kind of when I left that movement and was kind of taking a pause. I had lost the idea that something could be done outside of the party that I had come to, value quite a bit. And then just the fact of what happened with these killings, coupled with the rise in resistance 8 years ago, kind of posed to me a real question. And that's basically, are you going to sit on the side or are you going to get off the bench? And yeah, so here I am. But I sort of titled this 2021, The Movement for Black Liberation, Opportunities and Pitfalls in Building Power. And I think that that's kind of, where I want to start. Because this is not a critique for critique's sake or some kind of pedagogical experiment of any sort. It's aimed at trying to figure out the best way forward for a whole new and older generation of fighters, activists of different stripes who are looking to combat and seek justice against police violence and murder, and along the way may come to bigger conclusions about what's needed to do that. The starting point that I usually have when I'm talking to people and we're not from the common recent experience is to start from the fact that this is not the BLM movement. This is not the capital B, capital L, capital M movement. Although it is always in almost every forum, everything that exists, misname that. And there's a reason for that, and we can get into that in the conversation. But it's important to note that the vast majority of actions that have taken place for the last 7+ years across the country were not organized by the national organization called Black Lives Matter, or even their affiliate organizations. The vast majority were organized by organically created formed groupings around the country, many of whom were not called BLM, were called other things that their local groups thought about, who have different, a wide range of different political views and tactical and strategic views about what needs to be done. But the organization BLM was able to successfully, in some ways, take the credit for the reality of what was happening on the ground, and ultimately monetize and capitalize off of it. And that is where part of this story starts. Now, there's another side of this. If it was, I have a slide and it basically says capital BLM, Black Lives Matter, versus capital Black, lowercase lives matter. It's an important distinction because while while expressing that this, and if you've read the statement and the article, it explains the evolution of sorts of BLM and how they took advantage of certain things and, carried out certain betrayals, 7 years ago. And those strategies that they implemented after that, in some ways, has us where we are today, which is further behind than I believe we could have been in the rise and resistance that's taken place, the character of organizations in different cities and their leaderships. But at the same time, and you can see this most clearly with the resurgence that took place after the killing of George Floyd in the summer of 2020, that all kinds of people who are joining into the movement for the first time don't know the history. In the article that we recently republished, don't know any of that history. All they know is that I need to get out and do something and be active in this fight against police brutality. It's time for me to stand up and let my voice be heard. And the commonly understood banner under which that takes place is Black Lives Matter. That's a chant that's extremely popular, that was popular when we first began. And they don't know the history. And so they're not under the same yoke as what this history, the history of BLM implies, but they are susceptible to the political traps that organization has by assuming that everybody has good intentions. So you go and you find out, well, what is this organization whose slogan I've been chanting? And I'm saying it in the mind of somebody who's new. What are they about? What is this movement about? Where you're going to Google Black Lives Matter. And when you do, you get introduced to some things that I'm going to share a little bit later in the presentation. And that's why it's damaging, because the political perspectives, strategies, and of this organization, this national organization and its affiliates, are a misdirection to the movement of liberation, for liberation, a misdirection of who can be the players in that, a misdirection in what the demands of such a movement should look like. Leave aside who the actors in it should look like. So in that way, you can also look at the, kind of take a dialectical view of this BLM Nobel Peace Prize nomination, which makes me both sick, but also, if you can look at it in two different ways, it reflects the real groundswell that took place, not just in the United States, but around the world. I think it was a Swedish official who advanced the nomination. I could be wrong about that, but two things are true at once. There was and continues to be a massive outpouring of people who want to respond to police brutality, racism, and other issues. To me, that is the Black liberation movement. That's what I call it. That's what I encourage other people to call it, not the Black Lives Matter movement. So yes, that it reflects something that's very real, and it reflects a real pressure that's being exerted from that point of view. At the same time, it's no mystery who's going to cash that in. You know, in terms of any kind of, you know, public voice or direction or speech that, or set of documents that kind of lays out how do we continue to move. That's going to be BLM who's going to hold the mic in that situation before the world. So again, two things at one time. For me, and I look at history, U.S. history in particular, when I'm dealing with this question, I take I come from a perspective of understanding and trying to deepen my understanding of the radical Reconstruction period, both what it opened up, which was the possibility for widespread reforms that could have taken the U.S. on a course quite differently than it ended up taking towards imperialism, towards establishment of imperialism, the taking of colonies, the destruction of these, you know, radical and in some cases, you know, semi-revolutionary governments that started to carry out land redistribution, that started to organize the first public programs that existed in U.S. history, that began to have, you know, public offices and positions held by people of different, you know, by Black people, but mixed, you know, racially or ethnically or whatever you want to call it, mixed governments that were trying to take the collective resources of society and put them to the use of the popular good. And then the decision by the federal government that this was not in harmony with the march of capitalism, and basically turning their backs on those regimes, those Reconstruction regimes, and allowing the slavocracy, the defeated slavocracy, to reimpose itself in the most vicious and violent manner. You know, where some of the history of you know, where the Confederate flag was reestablished as a white nationalist flag, where the, you know, things like the Ku Klux Klan and the term white supremacy came into being as part of the counter-revolution that destroyed these regimes that did threaten the possibility of opening something up so broad that it would have made the U.S. very different, a place where structural racism could have been eradicated. It's hard to even imagine a U.S. like that, but that was what was on the table, and that's the defeat that we suffered. So, all
Brian,
that, yes.
you have 10 minutes. That was 10 minutes.
Okay.
So you have 20 more. Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, I just gave a short thing, longer than I had planned to, on radical Reconstruction, just to explain that, like, to me, the uncarried out tasks of that period in terms of uniting society and dealing with the history of slavery, etc., puts Black liberation at the center of the American Revolution. There's other factors that are part of it, but a key part of it will be the struggle for Black liberation. And in my opinion, at the center of that fight for Black liberation is the fight against police brutality. It continues to be the touchstone. It continues to be the thing that expresses the you know, it's a fire that keeps burning and it keeps exploding. And at the heart of the fight against police brutality is the fight to jail killer cops. And we'll see how much time I have to get more into that. But to me, that's kind of the progression of why, what any movement that I'm a part of or coalition I'm part of when I'm trying to push in it. Now so I said some things about Black Lives Matter. The article talks about, BLM, the national organization, but it wasn't just BLM during this period that was a problem. It was a largely unprepared vanguard organizations. Much of the left and socialist organizations slept on this struggle in its beginnings, failed to do diligent work to understand the tendencies and players in it, beginning 7 years back, and maybe with a couple of exceptions, abstained from involvement in this historic development, or allowed themselves to be baited out of it. No substantial critiques. There were some by a few groups, but there were no substantial critiques within the vanguard movement and its tendencies. By and large, it was either de facto dismissal of the developments altogether, minimizing their historic importance, or pandering to the national and local leaderships where we live. And again, I say that with the idea that there were exceptions, but the majority, no discussion about BLM superimposition or pandering to BLM or agreement with BLM superimposition of the legitimate fight of trans people on top of the police brutality struggle, and its use of identity politics to bait and other fighters in the movement. No real fight in the form of a public polemic against white baiting, cis baiting, and shutting down democratic discussion. And a real opportunity existed to raise consciousness of part of our class about LGBTQ+, about that struggle. And it was squandered at best, and in some cases pushed back. When people stand up and consciously join our historic task of liberation, their minds are open to broader ideas. The sails of solidarity begin to open in their minds. And if someone is killed by the cops, no matter who they are, who they identify with as, who they love, it's within the bounds of this fight. And even with reaction and reaction, even fighters who may have reactionary prejudices in this context can be one to support them, thus opening their minds further. But mashing in community violence muddies and clouds the issue. That is true when it happens to people who are trans or with general community violence. Because while we are trying to point our fire at the state, these, again, legitimate community issues, when they're meshed and smashed together into this particular fight, point the focus away from the state. It, in some ways, becomes an all lives matter inside the anti-police brutality movement. And it's as if the understanding of the proletariat, this is a kind of a separate point, and this refers to kind of vanguard organizations. It's as if the understanding of the proletarian character of the Black struggle and the composition of its characters, even if they weren't acting politically as workers from their workplaces, just flew out the window. I would go so far as to contend that if so-called vanguard organizations had made it a priority to involve themselves in this development, that the gains and even some of the outcomes of the individual fights could have been drastically different. I believe we have seen and are seeing something that we haven't seen in the last half century at least. And if you know me, which most of you don't, I tend to be very conservative in projecting the importance of something that I'm directly involved with at the time. I know that it takes time to be able to look back and weigh it carefully. So I'm in a very, very conservative way saying in the last half century, we haven't seen anything like this. the explosions that happened after George Floyd and the depth of it. I mean, I was driving home from some of the organized protests through neighborhoods, just random neighborhoods, white ones, black ones, rich ones, you know, so on. And there would be random individuals just on their block, not organized, just, I have this sign, I made this sign, this is outrageous, and I'm on the street with my neighbor or my buddy just with this sign saying jail, you know, or justice for George Floyd or something like that. So it was profound. And this is speaking of the time, I'm about to speak about the time before George Floyd. In that period where there was heightened resistance, you know, that took a lull from like, I don't know, 2018, 2019, things, there were things, but 2019, things might have slowed down a little bit in terms of public protests and stuff like that. But, you know, in the period of Philando Castile and those in that period, groups were literally prioritizing anti-Trump and, you know, kind of pro-democratic or social democratic demonstrations ahead of ones being organized by families to fight against police brutality. Sometimes they were counterposing on the same day. You have to think of the depth of that. Organized by groups that were calling them that call themselves socialists or democratic socialists, were organizing actions, knowing that on the same day there were families holding big actions on the fight against police brutality, and that their actions were just anti-Trump. That included people there was one case where our action actually met theirs. It was accidental, but they met and then they joined each other and marched together through the rest of the march. And you had people at the anti-Trump actions unwilling to chant police brutality chants, which was obvious, which people noted, and it showed you kind of like it just revealed a lot. I don't have the time enough to unpack that, but it revealed a lot. This happened in Cincinnati and in cities around the country, from reports that I've gotten. In Minneapolis, there was a day or weekend that was organized that had probably about, I don't know, maybe 20, 25, 20, I would say 20 or 25 families represented. And there were more people, but they represented, you know, 20 to 25 cases of people who were killed by the cops from around the country. At the last day of that event, which was on a Sunday, those families organized a public action, which had been projected for weeks, to call for an end to police brutality and to highlight their cases. Well, this was on Super Bowl weekend. Well, in the time between, you know, and this was public and announced and stuff like that, leading up to the Super Bowl, your activists, you know, radical types, decided to organize on the same day an anti-Super Bowl event that was counterposed to the family event. And many of the people on the left went to the Super Bowl event, not the family's event. Because, as they would have told you at the time, they saw the opportunity, maybe not openly, but I know some of those people in those groups, that their bigger mission was to recruit the Bernie bros and Bernie sisses to their groups. And that was a higher priority, to the point where they didn't even assign somebody from their group to go to the family action. So this stuff gets really profound the more you start to look at it, but I don't want to go too far into it for time's sake. Okay. So throughout this movement that we've seen in the last 7 years, I contend that consciously sometimes and not consciously other times, that Black Lives Matter National and its affiliates have created diversions from the path of mass action. And we've seen it morph in various ways. There was one in the very beginning, which was my first inclination for why Black Lives Matter Cincinnati had to be an independent organization. And that was the first thing they did was counterpose mass action to what they called at the time direct action. And they said, well, big groups of people, massively organized, that's what your granddaddy did. That's no longer effective. What we really need is small groups of people doing, chaining themselves to things, or with like guerrilla theater. That's what the new method for change is. Well, when I first saw that, I said, well, this is an old argument and one that I ain't with. And other people agree with me. So we started off independent. Then you had the issue where organizers from BLM would contend that Black males who were killed by cops got a higher clip of interest than women. And so those fights that were engaged where, Black men were killed were less highlighted by them, and created this idea that like the movement against police brutality doesn't care about women. And that moved on to it caring or not caring about people who were trans who were killed, even if they weren't killed by police. And divisions began to be sold. Okay, so we went through that whole period. Now we're in a new period, and the thrust of that political line of thinking has advanced this idea of defund the police. And there are hidden aims in these public demands. People like myself who think that the central thing we should be fighting for is to jail police don't have an issue with those who also want to call for defunding the police. However, most of the organizations who push for defund have taken a stance and counterpose it to jailing. This is not a critique of the demand to defund itself. It's how it's being used. In the proper context, with proper demands attached to it, in a different period, it could be a viable transitional demand, which is what the more advanced philosophical layers will argue that it is a transitional demand. But it's not being raised or fought for in that context by the majority of its proponents. It's some mass movement transitional demand aimed at having people on the streets against the state. That's not how it's being pushed at all. The aim, in my opinion, of these campaigns is ultimately to pull people back into the box, off the streets, and into the sham of the democratic process, and to push for legislation as a key strategy over jailing cops. The problem even isn't even, having, battles for meaningful legislation that actually makes the state pay for what it does. There's not a problem inherently in that, but it's the idea that you center that as opposed to organizing mass action to call for jailing cops that's the problem. Excuses and rationales for why abound, and they try to make defund seem more revolutionary and jailing more reformist. Well, I have a different opinion of that historically, but I'll leave that aside perhaps for the discussion. Whatever you will argue about which is more radical or which is more revolutionary in a vacuum, the actual campaigns and demands around defund have been thoroughly reformist in character. Even as clumps of activists at the same time in some places may be confronting the police or, escalating public action or, small public actions with those demands. That's not the center of what they're doing. I'm not sure where the term abolitionist began, but I do know that it's a rebranding of the terms revolutionary and socialist by many who use it. They see it as a rebranding and less in your face or on the nose. So now they're using this term. But BLM and its affiliates also mesh it together with the idea of prison abolition, which is not the same. But young people and new people call themselves abolitionists, they roll all those things together. And I'm not necessarily against any of them in the core ideals of them, but we have to unpack how they're used. They couch liberal and reformist actions with rebel sounding words, or they semi-accurately analyze some portion of the problem, but then argue completely reformist solutions. And again, I can't share screen, but if you go to two websites, the number 4, B as in boy, L.org, which is one of the manifestations of Black Lives Matter. They call themselves Movement for Black Lives as well. They have a website. When you first open up the page, the first thing they say is, "We told y'all." Now we can get to the business of defending our lives. Hashtag remove Trump. That's the pop-up screen on their website, and it doesn't get better. So you can go through that on your own and look through it and just think about what they're actually calling for versus what young people on the streets, what their spirit is calling for. They're not the same. The other site that I encourage you to go to is breatheact.org, which is also something created by that national organization. Well, on the Breathe Act page, I'll just read the front page real fast. In the honor of the lives of those stolen by police and state-sanctioned violence, and they list names. They launch the Breathe Act. This visionary bill divests our taxpayer dollars from brutal and discriminatory policing and invests in a new vision of public safety, a vision that answers the call to defund the police and allows all communities to finally breathe free. We are rising up against all the ways that the criminal legal system has harmed and failed to protect Black communities. The current moment requires a solution that fundamentally shifts how we envision community care and invest in our society. History is clear that we cannot achieve genuine safety and liberation until we abandon police, prisons, and all punishment paradigms. Translation. Go ahead.
Oh, no, it's 10:14, so you've been
I'm at
speaking for-
20. I'm at 20, right?
Yeah. Mhm,
Okay.
mhm.
So translation, we are opposed to jailing cops. And if you look at the demands of things that they touch, police brutality actions that they touch around the country, they don't call for jailing the cops consciously. They don't call for prosecutions in many cases, but in every case, they don't call for jailing. And if you look at that, and you look at why the families that they fight alongside, where the families are calling for jailing, but the strategy and tactics of the people they trust and work with don't. You get an inkling of why, not that it's the only reason why we haven't gotten convictions, but again, if the people who are organizing aren't for convictions or jailing, it's a problem. And it's repeated again and again. Leave aside that the real role of cops under capitalism is never introduced as part of these radical sounding initiatives, because the idea that they would, through legislation, defund the rooks and knights of capital is absurd. So I'll just stop there. And I'll end by saying that, again, just bookending it on the point that all of this discussion, the document that I drafted and that was published recently on World Outlook, the reason why I'm doing this, and I believe the reason why they thought it was important to publish it, the reason why you're holding this meeting, I assume and hope, is because there are vast opportunities, regardless of what was squandered, because there were some opportunities missed. There are vast opportunities that lie ahead of us and that exist right now to build the kind of movement that is focused on families, that is largely proletarian in its character, that can be an opening to building part of the movement necessary to gain the experiences necessary to take on not just the fight against police brutality, but this system as a whole. So that's it.
Thank you, Brian. Anybody want to ask questions, make comments?
Well, yeah, I'd like to come in just because I probably have to be distracted by a phone call again. Is that okay, Irene? Can I go ahead?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Brian. It's very nice to meet you. It's great to meet you. I apologize for joining the meeting late. I have a family member in the hospital with an emergency, so I've been delayed on the phone and, you know, stuff going on, and I probably will be again. Reading your article, which I commented on it, by the way, was such a, it was like a breath of fresh air, because you confirmed a lot of things that myself and, you know, other comrades have wondered about or have thought about Black Lives Matter, but we didn't have the details, which you filled in about the direction that Black Lives Matter has gone, and which we know a lot of other, unfortunately, you know, organizations, fights that started on the ground, but ended up being co-opted by nonprofits, by people who were opportunists, etc. I mean, we've seen this process over and over and over again. I mean, I'm 66 years old. I've seen it so many times that, you know, it makes me physically ill. But your article was so clarifying, and so I've just a couple of questions for you. One, I'm curious, what kind of a debate is going on within the various groups of Black Lives Matter? I mean, as a result of your article, I mean, I'm assuming that this landing in the world of activists was fairly explosive, because you've been, you know, you've had the courage just to come out and tell it like it is. Like, this is what's going on, and this has to change. This movement's been taken from us, we've taken it back, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious if you've had fallout, if there was a debate going on. And I'm assuming that that's one of the reasons you published it, was because you wanted to bring this out and initiate a larger discussion of strategy, tactics, and a program that will actually, you know, win the demands that need to be won. I said jail cops, et cetera, the things that have just sort of gotten swept under the carpet. I could say a lot more, but that's my initial question for you.
Okay, so Brian, should I just ask people to formulate their questions and then you can answer them all together at the end? Would you like it that way?
I don't have a preference, however you're comfortable. I think that I'm game to do it that way. I think if at some point Cheryl has to leave before we get all that out, she should indicate so, and then I'll come back to her question. But otherwise, yeah, I'm for waiting.
Okay, all right. Anybody else? Go ahead, Pam.
Obviously not living in the States, I don't know a lot of the background to this. Are you saying that Black Lives Matter and Black Liberation were the same organisation at one time, and one's gone one way and one's gone another way, or has one developed from the other? I'm just thinking about our organisation, Momentum, in Britain, which is not a Black Lives Matter organisation, but has done the same sort of thing. It started off with great intentions and just went absolutely pro-establishment and corrupt now, and has created a load of splits. So I'm just wondering the answer to that, really.
Go ahead, Janet. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. That was a fantastic background. And I'm wondering, I'm sorry, my dog's going again. I'm currently reading Mike Davis's new book and reading about the US organization and Ron Karenga, and I'm very involved with it's called the Legacy Group at our college, which is an organization of Black faculty, staff and students, and got involved in Kwanzaa, which Ron Karenga, one of the founders of US, conceived in 1966. And I've always felt a bit uncomfortable about this, but I'm doing it in solidarity with my colleagues. But knowing something of the history of the US organization, it seems that there's strong parallels here between what happened with us and the movements for Black liberation in the 60s and what's happening now with Black Lives Matter. And I wondered if you'd speak to that. That's
Thank
all.
you.
I-
Anybody else?
I'd like to comment if I could.
Go ahead, John.
So, first of all, Brian, what you commented about about counterposing like mass protests to individual small like civil disobedience actions, you know, which are, to me, it's almost like a moral statements. And, you know, we've seen that time and again about just everything from environmental issues to whatever, you know, a banner drop or, like you said, chaining 10 people to a doorway. And an example that I always think about that to me really says it all. On the one hand, I think a lot of the NGO, the nonprofits go for that. But something that I saw, and this was back in probably 30 years ago, I was at it was like a march protest organized by the Janitors Union, SEIU, in San Francisco. They were trying to get a new contract. And they had a march of, it must have been probably about 1,000 janitors. And they went to one key office building. And at that point, about 10 members of the leadership of the union occupied the front entryway. And so then the police came, and this was obviously prearranged. The police came to arrest those people. And they were going to give them a summons and let them go. And at that point, hundreds and hundreds of janitors rushed to the doorway to participate. They were going to actually block it. And when that happened, the union leadership got in front of them and said, no, 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 everybody go back. Don't do this. So it was, you know, it was clearly just like a moral protest, not something aimed at actually disrupting the system. And I think that in some ways is comparable to what you're describing. At least that's that, you know, in my mind. And so you see this twin role to me of the nonprofits and the union leadership. And it, you know, I think they both play that kind of that conservative role. Also, I'd like to ask what you think in relation to the issue of jail killer cops, of also raising that the family of anybody that's killed by the cops, that they be entitled to appoint a representative of theirs onto any prosecution team as an official member of that prosecution team, because we cannot trust the prosecutors, the grand jury, anybody. So the survivors have to have a representative, a lawyer or whoever they choose, to be on that team to ask questions, investigate, and so on. Then finally, I wanted to ask how you see linking up the issue of cops killing Black people and brutalizing Black people and others also, how you see that issue as being related to the economic questions. Because, I mean, we see like with the economic disaster as well as COVID, that it is hitting Black workers and people of color extreme, you know, first and foremost. And so it just, to me, those issues are all interrelated, but yet they're all put into separate boxes. And in fact, on the economic issues, there's nobody that's organizing any protests. To my knowledge, there's a small group in New Orleans. New Orleans Can't Wait, that on January 20th organized a protest around we need real relief and we need it now. And to my knowledge, they were the only ones that did anything like that anywhere in the country. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on those questions.
Anybody else? Okay, Brian, do you want to answer the questions that were raised?
I'll take a stab, but I think it's also useful if other people, if they have ideas about the answers, you know, how they see it. To me, that's welcome, part of the entire thing. So, um, what kind of debate is going on within the various groups? So there's a then and the now. So this document was written a couple of years ago, when we broke from the name BLM. We had long since been an independent organization when we first formed. They knew it. They didn't try to relate to us because we made it clear that while we would support any initiatives that nationally that happened that we thought were good, that we weren't taking directives from anything, and we weren't part of their network. So when we put this document out, it was a splash in a movement. It exposed a lot of things. I mean, we got a lot of calls from media. We got a lot of calls from different organizations asking, well, what do we mean by this? Or are you talking about us? You know, some people were riled up and mad. But you had a real layer of families and other organizations that agreed with what we were saying. And some of them pulled out of their affiliation with BLM. Some of them started to discuss changing their names. And some of them started looking closely at the program that we had developed at the time, our principles, which at the time were 10 principles that, you know, started with questions of police brutality and Black liberation, but then expanded out to, you know, supporting worker struggles, fights for women's liberation, some things on how we view leadership and leadership development, and some other kind of internationalist leaning type points. So that it did hit at the time. But again, it's, if you didn't know, you didn't know. So all kinds of people didn't hear about it, hadn't heard about it. People in various cities, I'm sure, never knew. And I'm sure the stories that we recounted in that article didn't get as broad of a hearing as it needed to get, I'm sure, because all kinds of people had not seen it. I think today, when we republished it, the responses that I've seen, well, I'll give you one example. A person called me up who was actually a mother who was involved with the fight at the time that I knew. And when we put out the document, but you know, she had some people around her who were part of that movement, and you know, she was too close to it. Well, when she saw the republishing of it, she said, man, literally her words were, I read the article again and with the introduction, and it hit me different this time. And I think that for those who went through the experience and now can go back and look at it, it has a certain impact. And I think it has an impact for those who are just for the first time coming in and don't understand all this stuff, which they shouldn't have to, unfortunately, you know, but unfortunately, this organization exists that they didn't even create the name, but they made a hashtag. That hashtag blew up and they capitalized off of it by claiming that name and owning it, even though they primarily weren't a police brutality organization. So that gets sort of to another point, which is that was raised by Pam about BLM versus Black Liberation Movement. So just to clarify, what I'm saying is that instead of calling it capital B, capital L, capital M, the Black Lives Matter movement, it is not. Lazy journalism, and in some cases intentional covering up of facts is what's responsible for it being called the BLM movement. It doesn't reflect the composition. If BLM is 15, 20, or even 30% of organizations around the country by different names with different perspectives and different programs about what they want to do about police brutality, which is the case. BLM gets credit for all that by calling it the Black Lives Matter movement. What I'm saying is there should be a different name that is more descriptive of what it actually is. The Black Liberation Movement or Movement for Black Liberation, whatever, that's not an organization that exists. It simply is a phrase that I came up with to describe what's happening, or the resurgence of the fight for Black rights, whatever you want to call it. It gets shorthanded into this BLM movement, and then people use it in such a way that it makes unclear, or it gives undue credit and thus authority to an organization that does not represent the movement as a whole. That's what I'm trying to get at. I think, I don't know if I clarified identity, but that's the thing I was getting at. And I don't think that organization started off on the right foot. I think from the very beginning, their political program was trash. And from the very beginning, their instincts, or for lack of a better term, or their actual policies that they put on the ground as it pertained to Black rights and police brutality were wrong through and through. They did things like tell, groups of people that were organized together, that came together to fight against police brutality, who saw themselves as equals, who discussed and carried out politics as equals. They came in and said, no, Black people are this, and then white people are their allies. They're basically an auxiliary that should have no opinion and carry no weight in the movement. Then they said that basically, that the most revolutionary sector, or the most advanced sector of leadership, were a particular grouping, whether they were queer or trans or whatever. And they created that narrative that was the case. And it's like, no, they're not more or less of anything. They're just people who are part of the movement who can or can't take leadership. But the identity politics side of things obfuscates and blocks the ability for real political discussion and debate to take place, which is part of the unfortunate tapestry of revolutionary politics, in my opinion, in the United States, that I can speak for directly, and probably around the world, which is the ability for people to have civil discussions, the traditions of discussion, debate, and polemics is at a low, an all-time low. You sit in a meeting with people and you disagree, and it's taken personally, or people start to analyze why you are possibly wrong. Well, you can't have whatever your opinion is about, whatever it is, abortion rights, but you're a man, and a cis man at that. Or, well, fine, you're a Black cis woman. You can't, your opinion on trans rights, only has so much weight. So all these things they hide the real politics underneath. That's kind of how I see that. Okay, that was too long. Union leadership versus nonprofits. So I don't think that's exactly the same. I can see the analogy that you're making, John, and I see the points of why you're saying that. But the difference is that the union bureaucracy, or those union officials, are part of an organization that's a mass organization that belongs to our class, and that has the potential at any given time to take a different course using the structures that exist. I think the entire nonprofit industrial complex is a problem, not just the leadership of it, but the actual structure and actually what it does. I'm not saying they don't do good things in the context of a messed up situation or a messed up structure. Of course, some good things are done, and they're good people who are part of it. But I think the class character of those things are very different. So that analogy to me only goes so far. I welcome a pushback or a different take, or maybe I misunderstood the character of the analogy. Family members added to the prosecution team. To me, that's less important. I'm for opening up all the books. I'm for cops being able to be directly prosecuted or sued. I'm for tearing down the things that protect them from being pursued. I'm for all of those things, and if measures or proposals come out of them that aren't also tied to other, I would not be opposed to campaigning around those things per se. And then the last thing is, how is police brutality related to economic questions? For me, they are, and there are, the biggest or one big reflection of when we've turned a certain corner, or when a certain sector of our class turns a corner, is when from their workplace you start to fight around social issues. That's partially why this question of COVID is such a thing. And again, the state of the labor movement in this time is what it is. But the potential for the labor movement to have fought around social demands that are beyond your workplace, the openings that these crises that we live under give us to begin to develop that frame of mind is enormous. Similarly, the possibility for the community to begin to take on demands that are in favor of the working class or sectors of it, like teachers fighting for, I have a particular opinion. I don't think we should be going back to public schools. Well, that's happening in where I am. The social demand and teachers are against it. The vast majority, 75% in Cincinnati. So a community demand to support teachers if they were to walk out or sick out, things like that open up the connection between economic and social issues. And yes, the deeper the crisis gets, and the more that, the more that we start to resist, I think, you'll start to see that the people who become victims of the police, while they will still look like me in a big clip, will start to look like other people a lot more because of the fights they're involved with. And I think that'll raise consciousness. So that's not a complete answer to the question, but I don't want to dominate the time. So I'll stop there.
I'd like to come in again.
Sure.
So, okay, so so again, I missed your entire presentation, Brian, so I'm probably going to rehash things that you said, but that's okay. There's so many things that are coming up in this discussion. I hope that we can continue having a conversation with you and further calls in the future, because it will not be possible to really delve deeply into all of this today. So, but like I said, I'm really glad to meet you and get to know you, start this process. This summer, when the George Floyd uprisings began and exploded internationally, I was really surprised, and I don't even know if disappointed is the right word, but I really thought that there would be, a demand to force Trump to resign. I mean, given what he represented, given his racism and igniting of white supremacists and all that, and given the entire crisis that we were in this country, I really thought that the demands of the uprisings would go way beyond just stopping police violence, but it didn't. And of course, I think we can safely say here that the reason it didn't is because it was, well, even though the movements are very spontaneous, I mean, again, I'm talking off the top of my head here, I haven't thought this through, but I mean, they were very spontaneous because they were happening all over the place, in small towns and places where we never would have thought we would have seen a protest against a police murder, but we did. But there was no, I mean, and the other thing is, it appeared on one level that there was no leadership. It was just a spontaneous movement. But obviously, as you know very well, better than we do, the Black Lives Matter as an organization, which again, it's never really been clear that it was an actual organization. It appeared from just, the public's point of view, sort of an amorphous group or a network of activists, so to speak. with a very, 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 very limited program. But so the main demand that came out of these uprisings was defund the police. And as you pointed out in your article, and as we all know, it was it was very, very limited, did not challenge the system. It didn't explain the role of the police, again, in capitalism, or it just, how it just is, it's an arm of the state. It just said defund the police, which it was inevitable that it was a demand that would end up where it's ended up, which was one, alienating a sector of the working class, particularly people of color, people in communities like, we don't support that. We have crime here. We know the reasons we have crime. We want more help to stop crime. But it was not a demand that was debated in any way democratically or thought through. And it ended up in some ways diffusing this movement. So, when this was going on, I was reminding people, go back and look at the original platform of the Black Panthers from 1968 or 66. It still stands the test of time, and it still needs to be done. I mean, their basic was a 10-point program, and people would look at it and go, oh yeah, this makes sense. I mean, that's the kind of, and so I would sort of raise that as a way to get people to start thinking that, what, we need much more of a program for this movement to build than defund the police. There was never, and the reason I mentioned the Black Panthers is because the Black Panthers started off as a self-defense organization in their community to protect people from being beat up and harassed and killed by the police. That has not stopped. So the question of, to me, self-defense and workers' militia is still a conversation that has yet to be had, a debate that has yet to be had, especially in the face of the rise of this white supremacist movement. I mean, again, I'm going to throw something else in here, which is that there's been no response on the part of the left or of anybody in, the nonprofits and the unions met secretly. I don't know, John, did you send Brian that article about from the New York Times about the secret meetings of the organizations? No, okay, never mind. All right. In any case, there has been no response to January 6th on the part of the left. It's as if the unions and the left do not exist in this country. It's been silent. So who's responding? It's like, oh, let Nancy Pelosi take care of it. Let the capitalists and their politicians deal with white supremacy. We know, and look at what's happening. We know. So that's been like a huge vacuum. And again, I mean, the question of, okay, so I'm going to land one more point here, which is talking about, for me, I mean, so the current gigantic example of systemic racism in this country has been the distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine, which is very disturbing to me. And it's not really being talked about that much yet, but it should be. The fact that, and I mean, to me, this is a demand that if you're going to address systemic racism, the first thing that should be done is that the vaccine should be gotten to the people who are dying from this disease, which are people of color and poor communities first and foremost. There was a map in the New York Times this morning showing Los Angeles and where COVID-19 is the worst. In any case, so, but these are all related because there is not yet a debate with it, and Brian, as I agree with you completely, want to underline what you're saying, but the left, unions, there is a silencing of discussion of these kinds of demands. And, of just even discussing a program, like, what do you mean? We decided that in the secret meeting that you guys weren't invited to, and we're just telling you what we're going to do. So I'll leave it at that. I'm just throwing these things into the discussion.
John, go ahead. Go ahead, John.
Okay, well, two things. I have a couple of points on my own, but I'd also like to read a comment from a comrade here who's in the Dominican Republic and for security reasons can't speak on his own. So he sent me this and he asked me to read it. He says, the anti-racist struggle in the US has been a powerful inspiration for the struggle in many parts of the world. And although the problems you describe have a lot of specificities, also we face similar challenges in terms of the ideological distortions in sectors of NGOs and even the left. In the Dominican Republic, there's a huge problem with police brutality and anti-Haitian racism and xenophobia. An internationalist perspective is very important to advance solidarity. According to official statistics, there are hundreds of unidentified people murdered by the police in the last 5 years. Many are probably immigrants. Also, perhaps also to open channels of exchange on an international level can be a way to strengthen the political conscience in the movement, also in the US, to identify common problems and perhaps solutions. So that's one thing. I wonder, should I leave it there, Irene, or should I had some comments I wanted to make also.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, I agree completely with you, Brian, about the difference in like between the NGOs and the union leadership. And, you know, but my point was that they play a similar role in the movement. And I think like as far as the union leadership, what's needed is opposition caucuses, rank and file opposition caucuses inside the unions to transform the unions. Obviously in the NGOs, there's no democratic structure and most of them aren't, well, all of them, that they're not workers' organizations. So it's a completely different issue there. Also, just I think that one role that you mentioned the issue of like identity politics. And I think just as far as a program that, you know, you can't replace the issue of racism with the class struggle, but I do think that they should be linked together and that you know, that we should explain that the issue of racism, just like the issue of male supremacy or whatever, or the environment for that matter, that it's an issue for the working class itself to resolve and that it's connected with the class struggle. So those are my comments, and maybe you'd like to respond to all of that, including the previous comment from the comrade in Central America.
Okay, Brian. Oh, John, go ahead. Unmute, John.
Say, have you got me?
Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to say what a refreshing discussion, and the lead off from Brian is I've found myself almost in a minority of one. I mean, the Black Lives Matter exploded over here, and we had people taking the knee everywhere. And when I was questioning what does it mean, you know, what are the demands other than the slogan Black Lives Matter behind it, you know, you come under attack from the sort of liberal left and the so-called revolutionary left, who are both tend to be drawn from the same middle class gene pool. You know, the liberal left are, oh, you know, this is great. We can show, you know, we can do a bit of virtue signaling and prove we've got a conscience, and then go back to our relatively cozy lives. The revolutionary lefts, and I always say a lot of them act like soothsayers. It's like they see a bright light in the sky and shout and start shouting, it's a sign, it's a sign, it's a sign. So to many of these alleged Marxists over here, it was a sign of the coming revolution once more. And so there was no criticism allowed. And when I was raising the question of what other demands are they making, I was told I had no right because of my white privilege. And when I pointed out that my white privilege so far had got me victimized, sacked, blacklisted, and almost killed on a picket line, I was told, well, I should be grateful because if I'd been black, I would have been killed on that picket line. And so I just resorted to some four-letter industrial words and told told these people what I thought of them. And since then, you know, the Black Lives Matter issue over here has sort of been left to Premiership footballers to take the knee before football matches, and that's been it. It's been totally devoid of any political content whatsoever. And there's also, as I say, this accusation of white privilege somehow. Now, I accept, you know, my ancestors were never bundled into slave ships, etc., etc. No, they died in mine disasters and things like that. And you know, I just wonder how the comrades over there, if you ever experience things like that and how it's answered. But above all, just thank you for this discussion.
Janet, go ahead.
Can I address the issue of white privilege? As a white working class woman in the UK, I 25, 30, 40 years ago, I'd never heard of or thought about the phrase white privilege. It wasn't until I moved to America, and this wasn't an immediate realization, but moving here, like the cloak of my working classness, working in a kind of very upper class field in the arts, I carried a massive chip on my shoulder. When I got off the plane in America, that cloak of my working classness fell off, and people looked at me and didn't see that. They just saw someone who was English. It took me a while to realize they see someone who's English and white, and to endow me with all of the privilege that comes with that. I have the job I have, and it's a really desirable job. I have that job because largely, well, yes, I'm well educated and all the rest of it now, but it's got a lot to do with my accent and my skin color. It's really hard, I think, for English people to get what white privilege means in America. It is so powerful and tangible over here. And I didn't think about it. I was totally immersed in class politics, but being white in America, and that's had me reflect upon this a similar carrying of privilege that we have in England. But anyway, I just wanted to share my experience of that because it's been profound for me to understand the privilege that I have here.
Brian, do you want to speak?
Yes. So I want to take sort of John and Janet's comments and put them together kind of into one kind of remark or one set of, one response, which is what I was going to say at first, John, and in a totally comradely way, but the people who told you that they would have been killed were right. And they were right to tell you that. And your response, in my opinion, was incorrect. It wasn't wrong. The points that you're making aren't wrong, but your response is incorrect. Before I go into why I think that's the case, let me start by taking on something that Janet said, which I appreciate the evolution of your understanding of given the reality of the U.S. and its particular history, how it made you stop and think for a second. But I don't use the term privilege. I don't use the term white privilege. And I think, and the reason why I don't use it is because of the reaction that it produced in John. When I'm, as a revolutionist, when I'm out trying to talk to people about ideas, and when I'm talking to people about ideas, I don't use the term white privilege. And I think what it does is it turns the white person, it's a passive description. of the situation that puts white people in a passive and in a passive position. The term that the angle that I come at this from is describing rights, not privileges, which is to explain that because rights are something you can fight for. Privilege is not something you can fight for. It's something that, you know, you have and there's nothing you can do about it. In that sense, it's very passive. So when I'm talking to fellow brothers and sisters who are Black, when the term privilege gets thrown around, I'm like, nah, man, don't think about it like that. It's not that white people have privilege to walk around without being killed by cops first off. It's that they have a right, which is a human right. And we should be fighting for the right to be treated as equals. Similarly, on the question of, you know, it's not that men at a certain point had a privilege to vote. It's that group had a right and we're fighting for the right. Or you see what I mean? When you base things on the field of privilege, it makes it impossible to be something to fight around. I give one example where, you know, there were, you know, talking to in the South, I was talking to some Black folks on the porch about politics in general. And we got into this discussion about privilege and rights. And I tried to explain some of the things I was explaining, and it still wasn't hitting them the way I needed it to hit them. So I gave an example because kind of a couple of neighborhoods away, there was a Latino neighborhood, which was largely undocumented. And I said, well, how would you feel if one of those Latino brothers would come up to your porch and say, man, you got a privilege to sit out on your porch. You privileged because you can sit out on your porch, because they can't, because the cops come and try to ask for their papers and harass them, or if they're drinking on their porch, which is legal, they come after them, try to get them to step outside their thing so they can charge them with public intoxication. And under those circumstances, I explained, well, how would you like it if they came to you and said that you were privileged, as opposed to them thinking, man, I want to be able to have the rights I want to fight for the rights to be able to sit on my front porch as well. So that might not be the clearest analogy, but it works for me every time trying to explain it. Like, we're not fighting for privileges, we're fighting for rights. And we should combat that use of the term white privilege, even though, you know, technically, can you argue that in terms of just a definition and using the English language that it's true? Okay, yes, but politically, it's not a good term. Let's see. So back to John's situation. So to me, the response to somebody who's saying, you know, you explain your story and they say, well, if that was me, I would have been killed. The answer is, yeah, you're right. How do we fight together to get past that and then get to the other issues? To me,
these were white middle class people telling me this.
Okay, if it's white middle class people telling you that you know, then there's still a similar response about literally taking on the use of the term privilege and the concept of it. Like, you would have been killed if you were Black. Still, to the white person, yeah, that's probably true. It doesn't change the political points I'm making. You see the difference? Like, and that's the whole terminology gets us into this idea that, like, it gets us in a defensive stance, where the real way, from a Marxist point of view, is to basically do a judo move on it politically, which is, yeah, you take that energy and you accept it. Yes, that's true. But here's this other thing, you know. So anyway, that's a broader conversation, but I just urge you to try to not allow that terminology to put you in a defensive state, and instead try to strive past it to break down the baiting piece of it without doing it personally. Like, oh, well, I was this, and this. It's like, no. Yeah, what you're saying is true. But so anyway, I don't want to beat a dead horse. Let's see. The connections between the class struggle and the fight for Black liberation. I mean, I have no disagreements with anything you're saying, John. In our 10 principles, which then expanded into 12 eventually, that was part of the thing, is connecting, understanding like the connection between how this system benefits from the exploitation and oppression of Black people, and how that's part of the thing. And I didn't get into it in this presentation because, again, it depends on who I'm talking to. But in some presentations and in some conversations, my point is, or I try to explain that, okay, if you're a first-time activist or whatever, like along the lines of Bertolt Brecht or whatever, like if you're a first-time activist, if you come out and you fight against racism because you think it's wrong, that's good. If you come out against racism because you want to stand with your brothers and sisters who are Black, that's also good. But the other reason is that the fight against racism is not for someone else. It's for you. It directly impacts you. Everything capitalism does to hold down one sector of our class, of any marginalized piece of society, is used against everyone else. And if it's true that wages are generally dictated from the bottom down, not from the top up, then it's those of us who are at the bottom that who are the most exploited, and the fighting to lift the wages of those who are on the bottom will help raise all wages. Similar, and the largest portion of Black, or correct way to say it is that, Black people constitute, or the percentage of Black people who are in low income jobs is of the largest in US, in the reality of the United States. Immigrants are obviously of the lowest category, but I agree, all these things are connected. We should be explaining them as connected, while we don't fall into a reductionist trap of minimizing, which I'm not at all insinuating you're doing, John. I'm just saying that when we're in the real world, when we're talking to people who do that, who are reductionist, Marxist reductionists, or who do say, well, I say that you can't end environmental destruction. Ultimately, you can't even begin to do that in a substantial way until you take out the system that's responsible for perpetuating it, because they don't give a damn about nature or humanity's connection to it over profit. Absolutely, for sure, that's our stance. But at the same time, if there's an environmental organization or group or somebody fighting environmental racism, the fight against that is huge. Whether they win or they lose, the fight is huge because of what they learn in the process of the fight, and who they might meet in the process of that fight. If they win, that's icing on the cake, and that pushes us forward. But yeah, so I just want to say, yes, I absolutely agree with your point there, John.
Brian, what about Conrad's note to you? Unmute, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So there's that, and there's another point. So yes, I mean, I think that there's no question that internationalism is a huge part of, what we aspire our organizations and our fights to understand and take up. One, we can learn lessons from each other when we do that, across borders, across ethnicities. We can learn from each other's experience, but we can also see them as a broader part of the same thing, even with the particulars of each country. So I agree with the person in the Dominican Republic that yes, these things there are differences, but at the end of the day, it's the same, and we can see it that way, and can explain it that way. So the other point was on, which I think is important, and there's not enough time to unpack it totally. Agree or disagree, I would suggest taking a look at the article that I also took a peek at on Bonapartism and Trump, because it gets to some of the things, or it brings it up. Whether you agree with it or not, it brings up some issues kind of around just the character of that regime. But I had a different response. Like I'm glad that, and maybe you meant it in a broader way, but I'm glad the central demands of these uprisings against the killing of George Floyd didn't crescendo into a call for Trump to resign. I'm thankful for that, and I think it's part of the problem. I think that the liberal portions of the ruling class and Black Lives Matter and people like Sharpton, all these forces were trying to do just that. So I don't want to oversimplify the point you were raising, which could have been a broader point about how come the Floyd, you were hoping the Floyd thing would evolve into more like an anti-capitalist or a let's overthrow the system kind of frame of mind instead of just remaining simply on police brutality. If that's what you're saying, I get it. I get the frustration. I personally wasn't frustrated because I recognized it as something that has not happened in many, 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 many decades, the depth and character and how deeply it hit into communities that were even like genuine middle class, like not upper working class that people think is middle class, the actual Marxist explanation, understanding of middle class, even those sectors were hit and impacted by this George Floyd situation. So it had a deep impact on society, which manifested itself to the point where the system was put in a situation where it realized it had to do something. Now, in the absence of revolutionary leadership pushing the demands and keeping them on course, what they were able to do was pervert some very basic crumbs that they threw back. But you see in the course of the Floyd movement, the rise in the defund proposals. That was part of pushing the demands back into the Democratic Party with the Breathe Act that was sponsored by two Democratic Party politicians. Yeah, I think that what happened with George Floyd and the explosions that happened around there is to be continued. It's unresolved. They were able to steer it off the streets to some degree, and they were able to steer it into the Biden campaign ultimately, whether it was via Bernie or whatever, but they were able to steer it back into the Democratic Party for the moment. But I truly believe that the lid on a certain level was opened a little wider, and they can't put it back to where it was. I think we're in a state right now where any particular any particular police killing or any particular thing that happens could reignite that level of social explosion. You know how we talk, I understand there being ebbs and flows and resistance and stuff like that. I don't think, like, while we don't see demonstrations right now, and I think the elections had a huge piece of that, I don't think it's like gone down into a down cycle. I think it's on hold right now. And it's undecided we're not in a period where people have just gone back into the shell. I think it's still like just below the skin, like very close. Yeah, I don't think that, I think we should be trying to push for something else, both in our class, and should be looking for something else within our class and within these actions, than relating it to January 6th or anything else. And I think that there are very deep and profound things that can happen to a movement, even within just the, quote unquote, narrow constraints of the fight against police brutality. Extremely advanced things in that context can happen, that we should not poo-poo.